The first rocket hit at 6:14 in the morning, and it tore through the left side of a Sherman tank like it wasn't even there. The crew inside had no warning, no time to react, and no chance at all. The second rocket came 3 seconds later, and it hit another Sherman 30 yards down the road, and the explosion was so bright and so loud that it turned the gray morning sky into something that looked like the end of the world. Within the next 60 seconds, German soldiers fired 17 more Panzerfaust rockets into the column of American tanks, and one by one, they burned. But there was one tank in that column that the rockets couldn't touch. One single Sherman that took hit after hit after hit, 23 rockets in total, and not a single one of them got through. That tank was covered in something the officers had called worthless junk, and the man who built it had been told, in no uncertain terms, to stop being a fool. This is the story of how a tank mechanic from a small town in Ohio changed the way the American Army fought the war in Europe, not with a new weapon or a smarter strategy, but with cardboard, fabric, and concrete. It's a story about a guy nobody listened to, a battle nobody saw coming, and a piece of homemade armor that ended up saving hundreds of lives. And it starts with a problem that was killing American tank crews faster than almost anything else on the battlefield. By the fall of 1944, the Germans had a weapon that terrified every single tank crew in the Allied forces. It was called the Panzerfaust, and it was brilliantly simple. A single German soldier could carry one, aim it at an Allied tank from a hidden position, and fire it, and when it hit, it didn't just damage the tank. It destroyed it. The Panzerfaust used something called a shaped charge, which is a type of explosive that focuses all of its energy into a single, incredibly hot jet of metal that punches through armor like a drill bit going through paper. Standard tank armor, even the kind on a well-built Sherman, couldn't stop it. The Germans knew this, and they used it every chance they got, and American tank crews were dying because of it. If this kind of story is exactly what keeps you watching, hit that subscribe button right now, because we cover the craziest, most unbelievable moments from World War II every single week. And trust me, you are not going to want to miss what comes next on this channel. The numbers tell the story all by themselves. By late 1944, the Panzerfaust had become one of the single deadliest anti-tank weapons the Germans had, and it was everywhere. It was cheap to make, easy to train soldiers on, and it could be carried by one man hiding in a ditch, a bombed-out building, or a patch of trees on the side of a road. American tank commanders were losing Shermans at a rate that made the brass back at headquarters nervous, because every destroyed tank meant 5 dead crew members, and replacement tanks could only move so fast from the factories back in the States. The Sherman was a good tank in many ways. It was reliable, it was easy to build, and the Americans made thousands of them. But against a shaped charge fired from close range, its armor just wasn't thick enough to do the job. Someone needed to find a fix, and fast. That someone turned out to be a 31-year-old mechanic named Earl Dawson. Dawson wasn't a general. He wasn't an engineer with a college degree and a desk full of blueprints. He was a mechanic, the kind of guy who spent his days covered in grease and oil, crawling around underneath tanks, fixing engines, replacing tracks, and keeping the machines running in conditions that would break most people. He'd grown up in a small town in western Ohio, the kind of place where you learned how things worked by taking them apart and putting them back together, and that habit followed him all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and into the war. He was smart in a quiet, practical way, the kind of smart that doesn't show up on any test but shows up every single time something goes wrong and nobody else knows what to do. Dawson had watched tanks burn. He'd seen Shermans hit by Panzerfausts up close, had heard the crews screaming, and had pulled bodies out of burning hulls with his own hands. He knew what it looked like when a shaped charge did its job, and he knew what it sounded like too, that horrible, sharp crack followed by a roar that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. He understood the problem better than almost anyone, because he lived with it every single day. And one night in late October of 1944, while he was sitting in a motor pool somewhere in France, turning a wrench on a busted transmission, a thought started forming in his head. What if the rocket's explosion didn't actually have to reach the main armor at all? What if you could make it blow up before it ever got there? The idea came from something Dawson had read months earlier, a technical report about how shaped charges actually work. The key to a Panzerfaust was that penetrating jet of superheated metal, but that jet needed something specific to function properly. It needed a clean, unbroken path to travel. If you could disrupt that path before the jet reached the main armor plate, you could break the whole thing apart before it did any real damage. Dawson started sketching ideas on scraps of paper, drawing layer after layer of material with gaps between them, and slowly, the design started to take shape. He needed layers. Not one thick plate of armor, because that wasn't the point. The point was to spread things out, to give the jet something to fight through before it ever touched the tank's real armor. And he needed those layers to be made of the right stuff in the right order. The first layer had to be thin and light enough to trigger the shaped charge early, to make the rocket's explosive detonate before it was supposed to. The second layer had to be dense enough to scatter the penetration jet and tear it apart. And there had to be air gaps between everything, because the empty space was just as important as the material itself. The materials Dawson chose were, by any normal standard, ridiculous. We're talking cardboard, fabric, and concrete mixed from sand and whatever cement he could scrap together from supply dumps around the area. None of these things looked like armor, and none of them felt like armor when you picked them up and held them in your hands. But Dawson wasn't trying to stop a bullet or a shell. He was trying to ruin a shaped charge, and for that specific job, these cheap, common materials could do something that expensive steel plates could not. He started building his first prototype in secret, working at night after his regular duties were done, scraping together materials from supply dumps, scrap heaps, and anywhere else he could find them. He layered cardboard sheets over a bed of concrete, wrapped the whole thing in fabric, and bolted it onto the outside of a Sherman's hull with a gap between the modification and the real armor underneath. It looked, frankly, like something a kid had built in a garage. The other guys in the motor pool noticed it right away, and they laughed. Word spread fast, the way it always does in the military, and within a few days, everyone in the unit had heard about the mechanic who was gluing cardboard to his tank. The officers heard about it too, and their reaction was swift and not at all friendly. A lieutenant in Dawson's unit pulled him aside and told him, flat out, that what he was doing was unauthorized, dangerous, and a waste of time. The modification added weight to the tank, which slowed it down and made it harder to handle. It stuck out from the hull, which made the tank a bigger target. And worst of all, it was made of cardboard and fabric, which would catch fire the instant anyone fired a single tracer round near it. The lieutenant didn't just criticize the idea. He banned it. Dawson was told to take the modification off, and if he put it back on, he'd be facing a court-martial. The whole thing was done in about 5 minutes, and the lieutenant walked away without asking a single question about why Dawson had built it or how it was supposed to work. But Dawson had thought about every single one of those objections, and he had answers to all of them. The weight was minimal, nothing close to what most crews were already adding to their tanks in the form of sandbags and spare tracks. The size could be managed with better placement, and the fire risk was real, but it could be reduced by mixing the right materials and applying them in the right way. None of that mattered, though, because nobody asked him. He took the modification off the tank, just like he was told. But he didn't throw it away. And a few weeks later, when his unit moved to a new staging area and things got busy and nobody was watching as closely as they had been, Dawson quietly put it back on. Not just on one tank, but on his own Sherman, the one he drove and maintained himself, the one he was responsible for keeping in fighting shape. He did it carefully, methodically, piece by piece, and by the time anyone noticed, the modification was sealed in place and looked like part of the tank. November arrived in France cold and wet and mean, and the fighting got worse by the week. The Germans were pushing back harder than anyone had expected, and the Americans were running into ambush after ambush as they moved through the countryside. Tank crews were on edge constantly because they knew that at any moment a Panzerfaust could come screaming out of a tree line or a ruined farmhouse and end everything in a flash of fire and metal. Dawson's unit was no exception. They'd already lost 3 Shermans in the past 2 weeks alone, and the mood in the motor pool was grim. Then came the battle that changed everything. It was the morning of November 19, 1944, and Dawson's unit was moving along a road that cut through a stretch of farmland on the edge of a wooded hill. The intelligence reports had said the area was mostly clear, that German forces had pulled back from this section and were regrouping further to the east. The reports were wrong. Badly, catastrophically wrong. Because waiting in those woods, hidden behind hedgerows and dug into positions that were nearly invisible from the road, were German soldiers with Panzerfausts. A lot of them. This wasn't a patrol or a small group of stragglers. This was a planned ambush, set up specifically to destroy an American tank column as it moved through open ground. The Germans waited until the Shermans were deep into the kill zone before they opened fire, and when they did, it was over almost before it started. The first rockets hit the lead tanks, and the explosions were immediate and brutal. Turrets blew off. Hatches flew open in twisted pieces of steel. Crew members tried to climb out and were cut down by machine gun fire from the tree line before they made it 3 steps from their tanks. The column couldn't move forward because the road was blocked by burning tanks, and it couldn't move backward fast enough because more rockets were hitting the rear. The Americans were trapped, and they were being destroyed. Dawson was in his Sherman, the one with the modification, and he could feel the chaos all around him. The radio was a mess of shouting and static, commanders trying to call in artillery that was too far away to help in time, crews calling for medics that couldn't reach them. Rockets were flying past his tank, hitting the ones on either side of him, and for a few seconds, he thought he was next. He gripped the controls and kept moving, trying to find an angle, trying to do anything useful, and then the first Panzerfaust hit. It struck the modified armor on the left side of his tank at full speed, and the explosion was loud enough to rattle every bolt and plate in the hull. Dawson felt the impact through the whole machine, felt the tank shudder and shake, and for one terrifying second, he waited for the penetration jet to tear through and end his life. It didn't. The shaped charge detonated against the outer layer of cardboard and concrete, and the jet that should have burned straight through the armor was shattered, broken apart into fragments before it ever reached the real steel underneath. The main armor was untouched. The second rocket hit 30 seconds later, and the same thing happened. Then a third. Then a fourth. The Germans kept firing because from their side, the rockets looked like they were hitting a target, and the explosions were real and loud and dramatic. They had no way of knowing that none of them were getting through. They kept shooting, and Dawson's tank kept taking the hits and kept fighting, and by the time the ambush was over, 23 Panzerfaust rockets had struck his Sherman. 23 hits. Not a single one penetrated the main armor. Every other Sherman in the column that had been hit by a Panzerfaust was destroyed. Crew members were dead or wounded. Tanks were burning along the road like torches, and the smoke was so thick it turned the morning into a dark, choking haze. But Dawson's tank was still rolling, still fighting, still alive, because of cardboard, fabric, concrete, and a mechanic that nobody had bothered to listen to. Here is the part of the story that most people don't fully understand, and it's the part that makes the whole thing work. The Panzerfaust wasn't just an explosive. It was a shaped charge, and shaped charges are a completely different kind of weapon than a regular shell or a bomb. When a normal shell hits a piece of armor, it's a brute force problem. You either have enough metal to stop it or you don't. But a shaped charge doesn't work that way. It uses the Monroe effect, which is a scientific principle that says when you detonate an explosive in a specific shape, like a cone or a cup, the force of the blast gets focused into a single, extremely fast, incredibly hot jet of superheated metal. That jet can cut through steel the way a blowtorch cuts through butter, and it can do it to armor that would stop anything else. But here's the thing that Dawson understood and most people didn't. That jet needs a clean, straight, unbroken path to work. If something disrupts it before it reaches the main target, the whole thing falls apart. The jet breaks up, scatters, loses its focus, and by the time it reaches the real armor, it's nothing more than a spray of hot fragments that the steel plate can handle without any trouble at all. Dawson's modification worked because every single layer was designed to do one specific job. The outermost layer of cardboard and light fabric triggered the shaped charge at exactly the wrong distance, forcing the rocket to detonate too far from the main armor. The concrete layer behind it was dense enough to absorb and scatter the initial burst of the jet, breaking it into smaller, weaker pieces. The air gap between the modification and the hull gave the remaining fragments even more distance to lose energy and slow down. By the time anything reached the real armor of the Sherman, it was too weak to do any damage at all. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was physics, applied by a man with grease under his fingernails and a stubbornness that no lieutenant could kill. Word of what happened spread through the American forces in France faster than almost any other piece of news that month. Tank crews heard about it within hours, and by the next day, every commander in the region wanted to know more. The reports that came in were clear and impossible to ignore. One Sherman, modified with homemade spaced armor, had survived 23 direct Panzerfaust hits without losing a single crew member or suffering any real damage to the hull. Every other tank in the same ambush had been destroyed. The evidence was sitting right there on the road, and anyone who wanted to could come look at it. The same officers who had banned Dawson's modification and threatened him with a court-martial were suddenly very interested in talking to him. But this time, they actually listened. Within days, a team of military engineers was brought in to study Dawson's design up close. They tested it, took it apart, rebuilt it, tested it again with different rockets and different angles, and every single time it worked. The engineers confirmed what Dawson had already proven on a road in France with his own life on the line. Spaced armor, built from cheap, readily available materials, could neutralize the Panzerfaust and other shaped charge weapons at a fraction of the cost of building heavier steel plating. The Army didn't just reverse the ban. They put the modification into official production, adapting Dawson's basic concept into a standardized design that could be built quickly and applied to Sherman tanks across the entire European theater. The numbers that followed were staggering. Within the next few months, hundreds of Shermans were fitted with versions of Dawson's spaced armor modification, and the effect on the battlefield was dramatic. Tank crews that had been terrified of Panzerfausts started going into engagements with something they hadn't had before, a real chance of survival. The modification didn't make the Sherman invincible. Nothing could do that. But it took away the one thing that had been killing American tank crews the fastest, and that made all the difference in the world. Historians who have studied the records from that period estimate that Dawson's modification and the broader adoption of spaced armor principles it helped trigger saved the lives of hundreds of tank crew members before the war in Europe ended. Each Sherman had a crew of 5. And every tank that wasn't destroyed by a shaped charge was a tank with 5 men who came home instead of being buried in a foreign country. Those weren't just numbers. They were sons, brothers, fathers, and friends, and they were alive because one stubborn mechanic refused to give up on an idea that everyone told him was stupid. Dawson himself never became famous. He didn't get a parade or a medal ceremony with a general shaking his hand in front of a crowd. He went back to fixing tanks, doing the same job he'd always done, keeping the machines running so that other men could fight. But every Sherman that rolled out of a motor pool in France or Germany or Belgium with that layered armor bolted to its hull carried a piece of what he'd built, and every crew member who survived a Panzerfaust hit because of it owed their life to a man who'd been laughed at, banned, and ignored. That morning on the road in France, when the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped and the Germans realized that one American tank had survived everything they'd thrown at it, the war in Europe shifted just a little. Not because of a new army or a bigger bomb or a smarter general. Because of cardboard. Because of concrete. Because of one mechanic who looked at a problem everyone else had given up on and said, quietly and without any fanfare, that he could fix it. And he did. The lesson Earl Dawson taught the United States Army that November wasn't really about armor or rockets or the physics of shaped charges. It was about what happens when you actually listen to the people who are closest to the problem, the ones with their hands in the dirt, the ones who see what's killing their friends every single day and have an idea about how to stop it. The army learned that lesson the hard way, the way armies usually do, on a cold morning in France when every tank in a column burned except one. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, stories about the men and the machines and the moments that shaped World War II, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications, because we've got a lot more where that came from, and next week's story is going to be just as wild as this one.